morning, everyone. This is Stewart Dalby, broadcasting from the White Hart Hotel for Mirador Television. My guest today is James McCleary, who is leader of the Liberal Democrats and has been leader of the council previously, and is now leader of the Democrats and prospective candidate for the 1924 election. But let's start at the beginning. James, are you from Lewes?
No, not originally. We moved here, my partner and I, in 2006. And we lived here we were here for about 10 years. And then we moved down to New Haven a few years ago. And we had our first child. So we've lived here for a long time. But no, not here from here originally. No.
Right. And where did you grow up?
A few different places. So I was born in London, and then we lived in various places when we were growing up. Exeter for a while, which is where a lot of my family are from, Devon. And then we moved to Liverpool, and I went to secondary school in Liverpool, and so I kind of gone from there really. And then moved around a bit for university and work, and ended up here.
Where did you go to university?
I was an undergraduate at Kent.
One of the 7 new ones. Because I was an undergraduate at Sussex.
Oh, right, okay.
And they were the Golden 7, weren't they? Do you remember? I'll tell you something. Being at Sussex University in the 60s, it was very good to be alive indeed.
Okay.
Anyway, let's carry on. Now, have you been interested in politics since as an adult, or how did you come to be a politician, so to speak?
I suppose a couple of routes, really. I mean, it's politically, I come from a family who are quite politically aware. My mum was a teacher and quite an active person politically, opposing Thatcher in the 80s and being sort of very active in the sort of
well done.
anti-nuclear movement and all those sorts of things. And then I did 2 degrees in politics, my undergraduate and my postgraduate, and then I thought, well, I should probably use those in some way rather than just spend my whole life studying it. I better go and do it. So I took a job working in politics, in campaigning, and I've worked for various large charities and campaigning organisations, and I worked for the party for a little while years ago. And then thought eventually, well, been talking about it for a long time, I should probably stand for election at some point and put this into action. So that's how I ended up here.
I vote Liberal because I have liberal values, and this is the whole point for me. Equality of opportunity and all kinds of things. And I do agree about a two-party democracy, but that seems to be getting a bit shaky now, doesn't it, in many respects? Because I remember really when the Liberals tried to have PR, it didn't work, did it?
Well, we had the referendum in 2011, 12, when they had the AV referendum, but you were looking at quite a flawed form of electoral reform, and I think what you ended up with was a sort of pincer movement between a lot of people who were worried about, worry about changing an electoral system that's worked for us for a long time in many ways, and then there were people like myself who would prefer a properly proportional system, which AV wasn't, and so you kind of got this. Both ends of the spectrum weren't happy, and you had this kind of mucky compromise that no one liked. And in the end, of course, it was thoroughly.
Well, both of us have worked in countries which had PR, with Germany and Ireland and so forth, and the flaws quickly emerged, didn't they? In Ireland, it didn't work because they couldn't get the stuff through because of those blokes down in Kerry were sort of against.
Particularly in the emerging democracies, new EU states. I mean, I lived in Romania for a year and a half, and my God, I'll tell you, if there's any bad form of government, it's there.
But these forms of government often don't come from their electoral systems, though. They're often from other places, and of course, people tell us that first past the post forms strong governments. Well, we've had how many general elections have we had in the last few years? We've had 3 different prime ministers. We've had 7 education secretaries since the last election. So I think the argument that first past the post gives a strong government has been pretty complex.
Well, and also, let's just stay with the national stuff. I happen to know Boris Johnson, as you know, and this time I said, because I'm a bit of a psychic, actually. I said to my wife, I said, I'm going to go and have a bet. I've never been to a betting shop in my life, and I went to the Ladbrokes, and I got a 6-1 bet that Boris wouldn't make a second term. 600 quid to me. Of course, I had to spend it all in the pub.
Oh, it's nice to know Boris has benefited someone financially.
Now, that takes me up to where I want to go. And I've been saying all along, fine, to people, young people particularly, I said, you bet you in the election we just had, the Greens will get the majority. And they said, how did you know? I said, because I am a little bit psychic. And secondly, I write about renewable energy and climate change and so on. And I think young people are now going to vote for the Greens. And I was right, again. They got 17, didn't they?
Yeah.
And you got 15.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then can we go into this, or is it quite interesting? So I'm now going around telling people that, that you tried to talk to the Greens about carrying on as you were in the last 4 years, yes,
mm-hmm.
And the Labour's wouldn't having it, were they?
No,
at first.
Well, I mean, to be really clear, it was Labour nationally, not locally, who were.
Yes, but then that was ignored, wasn't it? And then the Greens did an exercise with the Labour Party.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I keep saying, because of I'm very Green, but I think the Green Party here is managerially totally incompetent. That is my view. And are we going to end what we had an erstwhile situation in Brighton, which has now ended because it's Labour? But are we going to have that kind of council? Are you able to opine on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you there's several things there. One is about this point about movement in politics and people prioritising climate change and the issues around climate change. And I think that certainly the growth of the Green Party in the recent elections, which they did have some breakthroughs across the country. There's some good results for them. It does speak to somewhat to that. I mean, Liberal Democrats have always been an environmental party, so it's not a sort of threatening thing. And I think it's really welcome that people are.
Well, I always used to say a Lib Dem Lib Dems must be greener than green. Yeah, and I always going on about that.
If you talk to our leader on East Sussex County Council, David Tutt, who's been a councillor for a long time, he'll tell you that he was there in the 90s being laughed at by Conservatives when he spoke about climate change. So it's been a long-standing issue for us. So I welcome fact that more people are voting actively on that issue. In terms of the council, this is how politics work. People do deals. I mean, it was, you could arguably say there is more political alignment between the Green and Labour Party. They're both parties of the left of British politics, and Labour nationally are very threatened by the Greens because they exist in that. I'd say the Greens are probably the most left-wing party in mainstream politics.
Let me just put this to you. Not so long ago, in the New Statesman, there was an article, very interesting article, saying that the Greens had the opportunity to be the major party of opposition, but they wasted it because of their leadership, so forth and so on. So what that meant that basically the Greens had two leaders, right? And therefore, nobody knew who they were. They didn't know how to work, and that was it. And also, the Greens really, in my estimation, are a protest party. Nothing wrong with that, but they're like Extinction Rebellion. They have wonderful goals, but they don't know how to solve them or do anything about them.
Yeah,
that's my problem.
I think it's various things. When you talk about leadership, I think most people in the real world didn't understand that, or haven't understood the Greens have these co-leaders, and thought Caroline Lucas was the leader of the party, and
she's turned it down. She's turned it down.
That's the big challenge for them now, is going to be holding Brighton Pavilion at the next general election. Labour are going to come for it. They're going to put a huge campaign in there. Can they hang on with a new candidate? Caroline clearly is someone who I am sure everybody else holds in very high regard, and she had a huge personal vote, quite rightly. So it's a challenge. I mean, the important thing that people need to understand about here is, although across the district, we had this situation where the Green Party and ourselves are not far apart. We both did very well. For us, our priority is around the parliamentary constituency, which is on different boundaries from Lewes district.
And they're changing, aren't they?
They are, and it includes more of Wealdon district now than it did before. So our priority is around that, and in places where we were really keen to do well. New Haven, where I live, Seaford, which is the biggest town in the constituency by far. We did really well, and we put up a strong challenge elsewhere. So, we're well positioned for it. And at general elections, as we know, the Greens poll under 5%. So, what we're hearing on doorsteps, and we've been out on doorsteps a lot since the local elections, is people saying to us, we'll do the tactical choice.
Bring you back to Lewes itself. For example, the Green Party now in charge of all the council, right? Now, for example, they don't seem capable of doing anything. For example, look at that tourist office over there, right? It looks as if it's derelict, and the 3 buildings behind it, which is also part of the district council, it's derelict. Why hasn't the council? Tourism is a major money maker for this. Why haven't the council done something about it?
Well, one you'd have to ask of the council. But also I was part of that for the last 4 years, so I'm not going to pretend that I wasn't. The tourist office is obviously still used. The building at the back obviously is now the shared work space, which was one of my initiatives as portfolio holder for regeneration in the last administration, was to get that going, and that's been really successful. The other buildings, they need to find a use for them. They are quite difficult buildings, and obviously the climate hub was in there for a while.
You're doing nothing.
Well, you may, well, that's that. Your view, Stewart, not mine. But they've moved down into Lewes House now, and so it'll be up to the current administration to find a use for that building. I think that it is a challenging thing in Lewes when you have these historic buildings, which that is, to make good use of them that public support, and that is actually quite challenging to do.
Well, that's one thing. But secondly, let me go back to 2019, where I attended a sustainability meeting run by the Greens, right? And they said we are going to have zero carbon emissions, and remember, I know all about this kind of thing, 2030. And I said, well, how are you going to do that? And they said, we're going to have electric charging points and trees. And this was in 2019. For 4 years, it was only this year that we got electric charging points, because I helped, the Liberal Democrats did it. And all these charging points are now going into New Haven and to Seaford and so forth and so on. But 4 years, James.
Well, I think, Stuart, what the electric charging points in car parks show you is when people talk about the urgency of climate change and the urgency of the need to transition ourselves away from carbon and away from fossil fuels, is that this country is not at all optimised to deliver that in a short time frame. The fact it took 4 years, and I can tell you, I know the relevant cabinet member is now the mayor of Lewes. Matt Bird was the cabinet member.
Oh, don't mention his name.
I know he did work. I know him and his team worked very hard to get those in, and it was an extremely frustrating and very slow process. But you look at it across the board, Stuart, and all these things. When you look at retrofitting homes, when you look at solar panels, when you look at offshore wind, onshore wind, when you look at wave power, all of these things that are necessary for a transition to a low carbon economy are incredibly slow. And the next government, if Labour are the next government and they're serious about climate change, are going to need to make tough decisions.
Now, listen, this is very interesting. That Keir Starmer has just said that he's going to let the fossil fuels go on until the next election. Now, look, I've been writing about this for donkey's years, okay? And I can tell you, as I've been telling everybody, without fear of contradiction, there simply has not been enough energy investment in renewable energy. Okay, that means we've got to have a bridge. If we're lucky, it will be a gas bridge. If we're unlucky, it will be an oil bridge. But that is because there hasn't been enough investment. Everybody's talking about it now, James, but it's a bit late in the day, isn't it?
These things are, if you actually want to transition us to a low carbon economy, you need a 50 to 100 year plan. And the difficulty is that what we see are, big one-off projects like Rampion come along, and they're great, but you need multiple Rampions being built now,
Yeah,
and we need to be saying.
Do you know about Rampion? Do you know about Rampion?
I know that.
I went in and saw to him, and what kind of a subsidy did you get? And he said, "Oh, we got two, what are they called? Certificates, carbon. All the utilities had to have a carbon thing, didn't they? I can't remember what it was. Green energy certificate. That's what it was. And at those times, the electricity was about. It was about. Right, electricity. It was 50 quid. Right? And they were into, because it was offshore. They had two of those, so they got 100 quid subsidy,
Right.
and 30 for which they paid for the electricity. Right. So Rampion has got the most expensive bloody electricity in the county, if not in the world. You know.
But this is where the challenge is, Stuart, because the market hasn't been properly constructed, and I see this as, when we talk about British industry in a post-Brexit economy, which hopefully one day in the not too distant future we're going to see ourselves back in the single market, because I think that's the thing that's done the most damage to the British economy of anything, but leaving the single market. But,
I totally agree with you.
But you've got a chance here to say, okay, we could build here a modern manufacturing sector that supports massive growth in renewable.
That's what Keir Starmer's been trying to do.
That was what the Green Investment Bank, of course, of course, during the coalition government that the Tories scrapped in after they managed to kick us out in 2015. But there's all sorts of. But the other issue is about climate change, and the one that I think is a really profound issue, and one that I think people should, get overlooked, is you mentioned people who are perhaps quite extreme in their views, and they prioritise climate change over all other things, but what we have in this country, and the thing that you asked how I got into politics, the thing that exercises me most is inequality. And the inequality gap in this country is now gigantic, particularly generationally. And what we have to do is, with climate change and with all the other priorities, and these are huge priorities, have to balance that with also understanding that there are a lot of people who are in very challenging situations at the moment.
You're looking at someone who believes that the class system is the absolute curse of our society, where people can't get their jobs because they're working class, or they can't do this, that, and the other. I agree with everything you said.
And closing that gap for me has to be the government's number one priority. And the fight the climate emergency is part of that. But fighting climate change in a way that is fair, not one. And this is where I do diverge from people who can be quite extreme about climate change. Forcing people to do things is not the right way to do it. We have to create opportunity and encouragement to get people to reduce their carbon output. But saying to somebody who is on income support and has children's support, you can't have a diesel car anymore.
But you got to remember as well that there's the cartel of the big six companies, and they're supposed to actually use their carbon, the money they get in, to buy more whatever it is, instead. Right, let's look at this there. 2022, right? January the 1st to June 30th, British Gas made a profit of £1.3 billion.
Yep.
Where did that £3 billion go to? For starters, Chris O'Shea got a salary of £2 million. Okay? The rest went to shoring up Centrica. What's its worth of? So this is rank profiteering bordered on corruption in my field. Do you remember?
Yeah.
All this used to fit I used to get in when I was talking to these people,
Well, it's also, I think, fundamentally with the utilities, and we've seen this a lot recently. We've had power cuts, we've had water shortages. What is the fundamental purpose of utilities? It is to provide a supply at a price that's affordable for everybody. And if that is their fundamental purpose, they are failing. At which point you say, my difficulty, I was very small in the 80s, so I wasn't really old enough to see all this stuff happening live. But my understanding of privatization is it should introduce competition, drive down prices, encourage investment and innovation. These are things that privatization.
I couldn't agree with you more. But
where is the competition?
Look what happened with privatization. Okay, the coal miners. The first energy crisis started in 1972 when the coal miners went on strike. Okay, and so there was shortage. So people found there was gas in the North Sea. Right, Mrs. Thatcher got in and she privatised the energy companies, and that led to an oligopolistic cartel of 6 big companies. And they went on and so forth and so on. And with Ed Miliband, he's still rattling on about it. He decided that we've got to have an energy cap. But he said, if I get into power, I'll have an energy cap. But he didn't get into power, David Cameron did. And he actually said, well, what should I do? The Competition and Merger Authority. And they said, get cheaper suppliers. Well, there weren't any.
Yeah.
And the ones that did come along weren't fit for purpose. So you end up in a situation we got most recently where the government has to support, and that's going to stop next month.
Yeah. Well, and also you see the government propping up these companies. So, the famous super sewer in London, which is pretty much the only bit of major sewage infrastructure built in this country in recent years. The company, the Thames Water building it, Thames Water were backed by Macquarie, famously, rather awful Australian asset stripping company. And then Macquarie said, we've had enough of this, we're off. The government again. So the government ended up paying for the super sewer. And then Macquarie have just bought Southern Water, of course.
And they were owned by Australians, weren't they? Yeah. And the French had a bit of a turn, didn't they? And Southern Water, they're monopolies. That's the change.
They are monopolies. So if you've got no competition, privatisation cannot work, because the private sector can be incredibly efficient and far more efficient than the public sector. However, it only works if market forces are actually able to be applied to something. You're never going to drive down prices if there's no competition whatsoever. And you saw it. Look at the airline industry. Until challenger airlines like EasyJet and Ryanair and others came in and said, actually, we can do this way cheaper. BA and others were like, well, we'll charge what we want because there's no competition here. And so that's the power of competition. Without it, I just see. So honestly, Stuart, I'm not somebody who's I don't know whether nationalisation is the answer here. But I do think at some point somebody has to be brave enough to say, actually, these guys just can't carry on like this.
I agree with
we have to have a threat of nationalisation at least and say, hey, guys, unless you bring down prices, we're taking it back off you. And actually, if the taxpayer is already paying for a lot of this, which we are, at that point, what are these companies actually doing for us as a country?
I believe in capitalism and market forces, but I don't believe in excessive market forces and so forth and so on, nor do you, presumably.
No.
We've got to actually find a way out of this. I think Keir Starmer's doing quite well. But the problem with him is he has got a charisma bypass. That is the real problem, I'm afraid.
Well, you hope that people look beyond these things. Like, not everybody can be, sort of a charismatic and beware of charismatic politicians.
Well, hang on a second, though. hang on. Problem is that politics has been colonised by celebrities, hasn't it? It's just happened with Trump and it's happened with Boris. People don't vote for Conservatives, they vote for Boris because he's very good on television.
Well, they voted for Tony Blair for the same reason. You to get people on doorsteps. Norman Baker. Norman will tell you. He would in 1997 when he won here. People would come out on doorsteps and say, "Oh, I'm voting for Tony Blair," and he said, "Well, I'm sorry to tell you, but Tony Blair's not standing here." But it was the same thing. The celebritization is a more presidential style of politics where people are voting for the leader rather than having. And Keir Starmer. Everybody's different. It's just not his personality. But I think it's a mixed bag with him, and I do think I do understand why people find it a bit despairing sometimes. But also, Keir Starmer's in that very difficult position where he's doing exactly what Tony Blair did, which is making sure Labour aren't frightening to a lot of disillusioned Conservatives.
A lot of people are saying to me that Angela Rayner should be here. She's oozing charisma all over the place.
You need a team, don't you? And it's great to have people.
Oh, Andy Norman as well is very good. He would be really good, wouldn't he? But anyway,
the mayor of Manchester, isn't he?
So I must ask you this very difficult question: do you think you will be in a coalition with the Labour Party if they get the majority?
I honestly, no idea. It's really hard to tell because the polls at the moment, if they are to be believed, show Labour winning a massive majority, kind of by a long, long way. So. But as we all know, because we've all been through lots of election campaigns, polls always narrow.
Well, it's really. I've been telling people I know that. As I know Boris, I said he filled his cabinet when he was in power by a load of second-rate people because he feared that one of them might usurp him. Well, when he lost power, we were left with nobody who's capable of running the country. That's the situation now we're in, isn't it? Rishi Sunak is a nice bloke and he's managed to level the fire, but he's hardly,
No, it's one of those things where it's being less rubbish than your predecessor is the bar, and that is not the bar you want to be setting. And let's face it, the Conservatives over the years had built a reputation for being party of administrative competence and government. And one of the reasons that this country faces recession is a the financial markets and the global economy has a crisis of confidence in our government's ability to manage the economy.
Let me ask you this: back in the day, when Harold Macmillan got ill and so forth and so on, they said it's fin de siècle. And I think you know what fin de siècle is. And I think probably a lot of people feel that at the moment we're in a situation of fin de siècle, where the Conservatives have had their day. They're tired. They're weary.
I think it's a really interesting point. I think it's actually more than the Conservatives. I think we're at a tipping point in this country where we're moving into a new era. I think you've got if you like almost a consensus that was formed in the early 80s with all the things that the Thatcher governments did, that was largely continued in a fairer way by Labour, and then the Conservatives doubled back down again. We've gone through 15 years nearly of austerity now, and they've destroyed public services. They've
destroyed the industry.
Well, they've destroyed the economy and public service. They've destroyed private and public sector. It's quite an impressive achievement, really. But but I think we're at a point now where, particularly when you look at young people, I think you say to yourself, growing up in the financial circumstances and the economic circumstances they are confronted with, if you are in your early 20s at the moment, is a pretty bleak prospect, to be perfectly honest. When you have, salaries have been going down since 2008. You've got
young people can't get on the mortgage ladder.
Well, worse than that, your income taxes are higher than they've been in our history. They've got national insurance and PAYE, so you've got less money being paid to you, higher taxation, rents are out of control. I mean, you could spend here in Lewis, you could easily spend $1,000 to $2,000 a month when you're being taxed already. So I think that there's a moment here where we're saying, there is a moment for people to come along, and I hope that my party will be part of this, to come along, come up with some really mold-breaking answers to actually these challenges going forward. And because the same stuff is not going to work in the future, particularly with the growth of AI and a shifting global economy. That means that automation is going to become more common. It means
we're all going to be robots, aren't we?
Well, yeah, but it may mean that that there are fewer jobs around. And some people see that as a threat, but you could also see it as, what's the purpose of this growth if it's not for us to work less?
Why was there blue jobs ago? Because people during the pandemic just sort of decided to retire early, or just didn't want to do this, or why?
Well, going forwards, you've got the power of automation and the power of but also you're looking at a government at the moment that you've got to ask some serious questions about what sectors are going to survive this. Hopefully Labour, if they get into government, will come with some interesting economic policies. But you've got, I meet with people all the time. People in manufacturing, people in farming, people in these sectors are there, close to the edge as a sector of being there in 30 years, and the government are doing nothing to help at the moment. So we've got to look at how are you going to sustain people in the future. We have people living longer, which is great, but it means our pensions budget is gigantic now, and the triple lock is making that bigger and bigger all the time, which is good. People need to be supported, but it's a challenging situation.
I like you hot.
Thank you.
It's a challenging situation to be in. You've got to look at how are you going to model that out in the future to make it sustainable for the economy.
Well, it's very, very difficult for young people to get them. I think my middle daughter got an MSc in environmental science. Didn't have any. Got paid absolutely well. Fortunately, I was in a position to give my 3 of my daughter's houses. Lucky old me, but lucky old them rather. And people said to me, "Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this?" I said, "They're my daughters. I can do it. Why not?" But it's so difficult for most people. That's not a boast. I'm just saying.
No, it is difficult, and it speaks to it as how so much of our wealth in this country is locked up in property because we're unusually.
That's always been the case, hasn't it? Yeah.
Well, not always, because of course right to buy and the changes again that were brought in 4 years ago.
That's another bloody thing which Mrs. Thatcher says that meant that councils can't build council houses anymore.
Well, councils can build council houses, but the real problem is they've all been sold off, and so you look at anywhere now, and you look at Lewis District, which is a small district, right? Has over 1,000 people on its waiting list for council homes, and in the last administration and in the forthcoming administration, we built some council homes, but it's a drop in the ocean.
Now I'm really treading on very, very small ice. What about human nature bringing in 700 houses? What's your take on that?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So the first point is, of course, we're in a national park here, and the national parks plan includes developing the North Street Quarter or Phoenix site or whatever you want to call it. And you guys have been in Lewes a long time. That site's been sat there pretty much empty as a brownfield development site for a long time. Various people have had a stab at it and failed to develop anything there. So human nature have come along. Their plans are very, very interesting from a sort of sustainable development perspective. However, rightly, there are going to be people in town who are going to have some pretty serious questions.
First of all, there's the trees. 83,000 people about the trees they've broken down. Secondly, they're flawed in many, many ways. And no, not least, I sort of Andrew Simpson and stuff. Oh, but we were around, we were there, we were at the same meetings and so on. And I've discovered by going there, I've got links in Company's House because I've got business with myself. And it turns out on their 21 figures, there were £8 million of losses. They haven't got any bloody money. I'm pretty sure of that. And do you know Derek Harper, don't you?
No.
Well, he's in the Yelly a lot.
Oh, yes.
You do know. And Liz, they're the opposition because there's a bloody great big house going up opposite his house. And the Pell's Pool is going to have a bloody great down. And if you look at the latest thing about it, it's a load of prison blocks. And also you've got this question of affordable housing.
Yes.
Affordable for who? And they're going to have it all, so forth and so on.
But the question, Stewart, with that site is, and this is the real question, and people in Lewes, themselves need to make decisions around this. And I know it's, and having lived here for 10 years, I represented Lewes Bridge Ward on the council when I lived here, so I know the issue incredibly well. You have got there a heavily contaminated brownfield site. It needs flood defences. It needs a new doctor's built there, and the new dentist going in there. There's a lot of very expensive things that need to be done to develop sites. So your challenge, I'm not saying they've got the right answer here necessarily, but your challenge is how do you build out what is a very, very expensive site to make a profit, or at least don't make a loss on it. And what they've done is they've gone for density. That's their answer. So 700 units is a lot of units.
Yes, but it seems what's happening that they build the things before they get paid, and that's the problem. And they are very, very dodgy people. I mean, when you start really, interviewing or whatever you like, I said, but look, Andrew Simpson. I said, look, you are building foundations and charities, aren't you? And he said, yes. So I said, well, you're taking advantage of subsidies and all that kind of thing. Isn't that wrong? And so forth and so on. They didn't like that. After the meeting, he came down and said there and said, would you like a beer? I said, yeah, what about you? But he's very nice. He was on here, wasn't he? Yeah. He was very plausible. This is what I don't like about people.
Yes, he was. I mean, he made a very good case. We've only got a few minutes left. James, as you can tell, this is a totally different type of television. We have a Russian lady coming in bringing us biscuits because she's worried that we don't eat properly. We have the gentleman who looks after the bar asking us to test the beer, which we do because then we get a drink long before the sun is over the yard.
Very kind of you to do that for the bar as well.
But I wondered, Stuart, this is Keith, by the way, disembodied voice off. But I'd love you to come back if you don't mind, because you've had a very spirited conversation about, generally speaking, what's happening in the country. I'd like to ask you a few questions about local, and we haven't had time. But the one question that I would ask you is this. You've been mates with the Greens for 4 years. Now you're in the position of opposition. And our democratic system depends upon a spirited opposition. Are you going to be spirited?
Yes, well, absolutely. First of all, just on our Russian friend here, I'm actually going to Borscht and Bake tonight at the Hillcrest Centre, which is the Ukrainians are going to be making borscht. My master's degree is in Russian history, so I love borscht. One of my favourite things in the world. Yes, absolutely. I mean, as an opposition, let's be clear here. The administration, as it is now at the council, are continuing with the corporate plan that we agreed as part of the administration back in 2019-20 time. So a lot of what they're going to be doing, we're going to say we agree with because it's stuff that we agreed at the time. What we're going to be doing is scrutinising projects. We're going to be keeping a close eye on new things that come forward, and we're going to be asking questions on behalf of the public, and that includes things like like NSQ, the North Street development. I mean, that's a national park, but the district council has a big role in it.
And the Imagine Makepeace I think what I told you. I told Tony Park when he told you. Imagine Makepeace was being investigated.
Oh, really?
You don't remember that?
I don't. But
she is part on the planning committee, and she put a bloody great shack in her back garden.
Well, I'm sure if that's the case, it's being looked into. But look,
it is being looked into. We actually see ourselves as opposition to everybody. God bless you. And we do stamp our feet and we yell and we scream. The only criticism, really, that I would have of you and the Lib Dems and so on and so forth is I spent 17 years in Canada. That's where I cut my teeth on journalism, where every public office has a press room.
Right.
And it doesn't matter whether it's a small town or whether it's a big, you don't even talk to us. When you actually want to make a point, is this should be the first point of contact. We don't hear from you at all. And we're very happy to open up our airwaves to you.
We did actually speak about this. So, yes, but this is what I was talking to Keith before, to James before you came in. But what Keith wants to have is some kind of relationship with you. And you were talking about the paucity of the local press because classified ads on and people can't afford to buy people.
They try their best.
Dare I say it, of our calibre, but there you are. And I think if we could actually, I'm not saying that we're going to be hand in cuff, and actually, do what you say or what you would say, but just have a relationship with you.
Good spirited debate once a week.
Always happy to do that. And I mean, just to be clear on the local press, I mean, the local journalists at the Sussex Express, and at the Argus, and they're all very young guys, and they work their socks off, and a lot of them are starting their careers. But it is just the situation they're in, and I think that it's another problem for this country has been the lack of support for local press, and that includes the BBC at the local level. The government have directly attacked the BBC and Channel 4, and it's a deliberate attempt to reduce the critical information that people get from the press, and the press plays such an important role in our society and should ask difficult questions. But if you reduce down the viable press to the Mail and the Sun, then you're only going to get a certain view on.
Well, you see, this is Murdoch. Murdoch is an absolute plague on our media and our culture. Now, two of my three daughters said to me, "Dad, what's your major achievement?" And I said, "Well, after you, I've written for the Financial Times, I've written for this paper, Observer, I've written for the Guardian, I have travel writer, and I'm a novelist. My major achievement."
We are coming to the end, and James, I would like you to come back, and I'd like perhaps the Lib Dems, because you are the opposition, to come regularly. There is a Harvard University review that shows that with the shrinkage of local media, the governance gets worse and the cost goes up. And with all due respect, Lewis seems to be a prime example of that. And you may say, "Hey, Keith, come on, stop it." But say it publicly. Let's have a fight.
There's definitely a whole separate discussion to be had about the cost of local government and whether Lewis is actually that expensive. But anyway, that's another matter.
Yeah, well, will you come very regularly to us?
Absolutely, yes, happy to.
Okay.
I'm in Lewis.
Thank you very much for being with Stewart this morning. A very interesting conversation. Just once again, James is the leader of the Liberal Democrats here. But also the candidate for the next election. And I have no objection whatsoever on this station to you sticking your head above the parapet and telling us why you should be. Because the same criticism with you is we never heard from the MP either in 4 years. So.
Other people. Good luck with that.
Right. Okay. That's it for this morning. Thank you very much, Stewart, James.
Thank you.